In the quiet town of Red Hollow, the weather had always been predictable. The residents were accustomed to gentle breezes and occasional showers, but that afternoon, the sky began to change in a disturbing way. Dense, dark clouds started to gather on the horizon, moving with unusual speed. The air, once fresh, was now charged with electricity, and a sense of unease began to spread among the inhabitants. As the first drops of rain fell, the townspeople hurried to their homes, closing windows and doors, preparing for what seemed to be an intense storm. Among them was Mr. Thompson, a middle-aged man who lived alone in an old house on the outskirts of town. He had faced many storms in his life, but this one felt different. There was something in the distant thunder that made him uneasy, a sound he couldn't quite place, yet it felt strangely familiar. As the storm drew nearer, the thunder began to sound louder and more frequent. Each rumble was followed by a bright flash of lightning that lit up the sky, revealing the shadows of trees swaying violently in the wind. The electricity in the air seemed to pulse with a life of its own, as if something more was about to happen. Mr. Thompson, sitting in his worn leather armchair, listened intently to the sound of the thunder. Something about it deeply disturbed him. He closed his eyes and tried to push away the growing discomfort, but each new thunderclap seemed to bring a sense of déjà vu, as if he were hearing something he had experienced before. Then he realized. Amid the thunder, between the roars, there was a voice. It wasn't just a sound, but a voice, faint and distorted, almost like a whisper lost in the depths of the storm. Mr. Thompson froze, trying to convince himself it was just his imagination, a trick of the mind caused by fear. But when the next thunder echoed across the sky, he heard it again, clearer this time. Father. Mr. Thompson's heart stopped for a moment. He knew that voice. It was the voice of his son, Michael, who had disappeared almost 10 years ago without a trace. He abruptly stood up from the armchair, looking toward the window as the storm intensified. The sound of his son's voice in the thunder filled him with deep terror, but also with desperate hope. He couldn't ignore what he had heard. Something in the storm was connected to Michael's disappearance, and he needed to find out what it was. However, as the storm raged outside, one thing was certain. This was no ordinary storm, and whatever was coming with it was just beginning to reveal its true nature. Red Hollow would never be the same again. The storm that battered Red Hollow continued to grow in intensity, and with it, the thunder became more frequent and deafening. Mr. Thompson couldn't get Michael's voice out of his head, the voice he had heard the night before. He spent the entire night awake, sitting on the edge of his bed, listening to the thunder that, to him, carried something more than just the sound of the sky breaking apart. The next morning, the town awoke to an even heavier atmosphere. The streets, normally full of life, were deserted. The few who ventured outside did so with unusual haste, glancing at the sky with apprehension. It wasn't just Mr. Thompson who was disturbed. There was a palpable tension in the air, as if everyone felt that something was very wrong. In the small local market, where the residents usually gathered to gossip about the town's happenings, the topic was unanimous: the storm. Everyone talked about the intensity of the thunder, but there was a group of people who were particularly unsettled. They were those who, like Mr. Thompson, had lost someone close in recent years. Among them was Margaret, a woman in her early 60s who had lost her younger sister under mysterious circumstances decades ago. Margaret had always been a skeptical woman, but that morning she was visibly shaken. She told a few acquaintances that the night before, as the storm raged outside, she had heard her sister's voice, whispering her name amid the thunder. Others began to share similar experiences, voices that came and went with the thunder, all belonging to people who had disappeared, or worse, were dead. The voices, though faint and distorted, were unmistakable to those who heard them. They weren't just random sounds, they were words, short phrases, often calling for help, other times revealing long-buried secrets. When Mr. Thompson heard the accounts of other residents, he realized he wasn't alone. What he had feared the night before was real. The voices in the thunder were a sort of echo from the past, a manifestation of something no one yet understood. He knew he needed to talk to others, find out more about what was happening, but he also knew it wouldn't be easy. Later that day, a meeting was called at the town's church, a place where the residents always gathered in times of crisis. As the thunder continued to rumble outside, the church was packed. Everyone was eager to understand what was happening, but no one had answers. The priest, an elderly man who had seen many strange things in Red Hollow, was as lost as the others. During the meeting, the residents began to share their experiences with the voices. Each account seemed more disturbing than the last. Voices of husbands, wives, children, all disappeared or dead, echoed in the thunder. And as the stories were told, a dark unease began to take hold of everyone. It was then that Mr. Thompson stood up. He wasn't one to speak in public, but he felt he needed to share what he had heard. He spoke about Michael's voice, his missing son, and how it had called to him the night before. The room fell silent as he spoke, and for a moment all eyes were on him. However, as the storm continued to rage outside, one thing became clear to everyone present. The thunder was not just a natural phenomenon. It was something more, something that was trying to communicate with them. Something that was bringing the secrets of the past to light. And with that, a deep fear began to take root in each of them. But as the meeting ended, one question lingered in the air. Why now? Why, after so many years, were the voices of the disappeared returning? No one had the answer, but everyone knew that until the storm passed, Red Hollow would be trapped in a cycle of fear and mystery. As the storm continued to ravage Red Hollow, the thunder seemed increasingly laden with dark intentions. The townspeople, now convinced that the thunder carried more than just atmospheric noise, began to watch the sky with a mixture of dread and fascination. No one dared to go outside at night, but inside their homes, families gathered, trying to make sense of the voices that resonated in the heavens. Mr. Thompson, still shaken by the voice of his son Michael, became obsessively devoted to investigating the disappearances that had plagued the town for decades. He believed that the answer to the storm's mystery lay in the untold stories of the victims. If he could uncover the truth, he might find a way to calm the voices and, perhaps, bring peace to the lost souls. He began visiting old residents, people who, like him, had lost loved ones. In his search, he found Margaret, who had lost her sister years ago and had recently heard her voice in the thunder. Margaret revealed that before her sister disappeared, she had mentioned something about a secret place where many of the missing used to meet. It was a location outside the town's limits, near an old abandoned mine, where strange things were said to happen. With this new information, Mr. Thompson began to explore the history of the mine and the secret place Margaret had mentioned. He scoured old files in the town's library, spoke to the elders, and eventually found a name that appeared frequently in the accounts: Samuel Granger. Samuel Granger had been one of the first to disappear many years ago. He was a reclusive man, known for his strange practices and interest in the occult. After his disappearance, many others followed, but Samuel was always a common point in the stories of those who vanished after him. There were rumors that he was involved in something sinister, something that might be connected to the strange events now plaguing Red Hollow. As Mr. Thompson delved deeper into his investigation, he found an old diary hidden among the church's archives. The diary, covered in dust and yellowed with age, had belonged to Samuel Granger. The pages were filled with cryptic notes and unsettling drawings, but one passage caught his attention. The thunder brings the voices of the departed. Their words are the echo of past sins. The storm is the veil that hides what we have done, but the veil is unraveling. What we did in the mine must remain buried, or all will suffer. Granger's words resonated deeply with Mr. Thompson. He knew that to understand what was happening, He would need to discover what had really occurred in the mine and what Samuel and the others had been trying to conceal. As he pondered the diary and the new revelations, the storm outside seemed to roar more fiercely, as if it knew its secrets were about to be unveiled. The thunder grew more intense, and the voices more desperate. However, Mr. Thompson also felt that he was approaching something terrible. Whatever Samuel Granger had done seemed to be rooted in an ancient evil, something that was now trying to break through the barriers that had contained it for so long. The town of Red Hollow was about to discover the secrets that had been buried along with the disappeared. But at what cost? With Samuel Granger's diary in hand, Mr. Thompson knew he was entering dangerous territory. The answers he sought were close, but the storm, with its menacing thunder and ghostly voices, was only beginning to show its true power. With Samuel Granger's diary in hand, Mr. Thompson felt that he was finally beginning to understand the darkness that loomed over Red Hollow. However, what he had discovered so far was only the tip of a much deeper and more terrifying iceberg. The disturbing drawings and cryptic words in the diary suggested that something evil had been awakened in the old mine on the outskirts of town. Time was running out, and he knew he needed to act quickly. That night, as the storm continued to rage above Red Hollow, Mr. Thompson returned to the library, determined to uncover more secrets. He sifted through old documents, faded newspapers, and town records, trying to connect the dots. Among the piles of papers, he found a series of articles dating back nearly 50 years, reporting a series of unexplained disappearances in the town. Samuel Granger's name appeared repeatedly in the articles, always linked to strange and inexplicable events. The articles mentioned bizarre rituals and secret gatherings at the mine, where Granger and a small group of followers supposedly met to practice what they called communion with spirits. The reports were vague, often avoiding details, but one thing was certain. The disappearances began shortly after these meetings. Intrigued, Mr. Thompson decided to visit the old mine, a place most residents had avoided for decades. The mine was a few miles from the town, surrounded by a dense forest that seemed even more threatening under the dark and stormy sky. Armed with a flashlight and Granger's diary, he headed there, feeling that the mine might hold the answers he was desperately seeking. Upon reaching the mine's entrance, he was greeted by a cold wind that seemed to blow directly from its depths. The darkness was total, and the distant sound of the storm seemed to echo through the abandoned tunnels. Thompson hesitated for a moment, fear holding him in place, but the memory of Michael's voice urged him to continue. Walking through the abandoned galleries, the flashlight's beam revealed old wooden supports, now rotten and weakened by time, and strange markings on the walls, like symbols carved in a language he couldn't understand. As he advanced, Mr. Thompson began to feel a presence around him, as if he were being watched by something hiding in the shadows. Finally, he reached a larger chamber, where the air seemed thicker, laden with a metallic smell. In the center of the room was a stone altar, covered in moss and dust, but still emanating a disturbing energy. Around the altar, remnants of melted candles and broken bones told the story of ancient rituals performed there many years ago. Then he saw something that made him freeze. On one of the chamber's walls, there was a crude drawing made with charcoal or some type of dark pigment. The image depicted a storm like the one ravaging Red Hollow, with lightning bolts striking human figures that seemed to be pleading for mercy. Underneath the drawing, words in an ancient script were engraved, but one phrase stood out, clear and sinister. "What was summoned cannot be undone." As Mr. Thompson examined the altar and the inscriptions, the thunder outside seemed to intensify, and he realized that the voices, once distant, were now closer, almost like whispers around him. The feeling of being watched became unbearable, and he felt a wave of panic rise up his spine. As he hurried out of the chamber, he noticed something even more disturbing. The voices in the thunder were now clearly directed at him. Names, secrets, and accusations echoed in his mind, revealing sins and mistakes from the past, both his and those of other Red Hollow residents. The storm was revealing the truths that had been buried along with the disappeared, and Mr. Thompson understood that whatever Samuel Granger and his followers had done in the mine had brought something back, something that now sought revenge. Returning to town, he knew he would need to share his discoveries with the others, but fear consumed him. Whatever was hidden in the storm had been unleashed, and now the entire town was in danger. The past that Red Hollow had tried to forget was resurfacing, bringing with it a darkness that no one knew how to face. The days following Mr. Thompson's discovery in the mine were marked by a growing sense of despair in Red Hollow. The storm, which seemed to have a will of its own, showed no signs of letting up. On the contrary, each day, the thunder grew more intense and the voices more distinct. Fear, initially contained in whispers among the residents, was now palpable, a constant presence that seemed to weigh on everyone. The church, which had once served as a refuge for the townspeople in times of crisis, was now the scene of increasingly tense meetings. The gatherings, which had begun as attempts to understand what was happening, quickly turned into chaos of accusations and despair. No one knew whom to trust, as the voices in the thunder revealed secrets many thought were buried forever. The tension reached its peak when, during one of these meetings, Mr. Thompson stood up to share his findings in the mine. He spoke about the altar, the symbols, and the disturbing drawing that indicated something had been awakened there. Samuel Granger's words, engraved on the chamber wall, echoed in everyone's mind. What was summoned cannot be undone. As Thompson spoke, the looks of those present alternated between fear and disbelief. Some of the older residents remembered Samuel Granger and the rumors that circulated about him at the time, but most had chosen to forget. Now, those memories were coming back with full force, and panic began to take hold. It was then that Margaret, visibly shaken, stood up. She had heard her sister's voice again the previous night, this time clearer and more anguished. Margaret told the others that her sister had mentioned a name: Eleanor. The mention of this name caused an immediate stir among the older residents. Eleanor had been one of the first to disappear, a young woman known for her beauty and kindness, who mysteriously vanished shortly before Samuel Granger. The voices in the thunder, now linked to specific names, seemed intent on exposing Red Hollow's darkest secrets. As more residents began to hear the voices of their missing loved ones, it became clear that the storm was revealing a truth that no one was prepared to face. Among the residents, suspicions began to grow. Old grudges and mistrusts were rekindled. Those who had been close to the victims, or who had been associated with Samuel Granger in any way, were now viewed with suspicion. The town, which had once been a united community, was now divided, with everyone looking over their shoulder, fearing what the thunder might reveal next. Meanwhile, the storm continued to intensify. The thunder sounded like a hammer, constantly pounding on the residents' minds, and the voices that accompanied it became more insistent, more demanding. Some of these voices began to accuse directly, revealing crimes and betrayals that had been hidden for years. The revelations were devastating, and the town began to crumble under the weight of its own sins. Mr. Thompson, tormented by the voices and what he had discovered in the mine, felt the guilt growing inside him. He knew that somehow he was connected to it all. Michael, his son, had disappeared under mysterious circumstances, and now, with the storm's revelations, he began to wonder if there was more to his son's story than he had imagined. The paranoia in Red Hollow reached a critical point when a group of residents, led by those who had lost the most, decided it was time to act. They believed that the key to ending the storm and the voices lay in destroying what remained of the mine and Samuel Granger's altar. However, there were others who believed that tampering with the past would only make things worse. As the debate continued, the town was on the brink of collapse. The collective fear, fueled by the thunder and the revelations of the disappeared, threatened to tear Red Hollow apart from within. And everything indicated that the storm would not stop until its secrets were fully exposed, or until the town was consumed by it. Mr. Thompson, lost between guilt and despair, knew that the decision that was about to be made could mean the end of everything he knew. But he also knew that, one way or another, the past was coming back to haunt everyone, and the price for ignoring it would be terrible. The tension in Red Hollow had reached an unbearable point. Each night, the storm became more violent, and the voices in the thunder clearer, almost as if the lost souls were drawing closer to the town, seeking justice or revenge. The residents were divided on how to deal with the terror surrounding them. While some believed they should confront the buried secrets, others feared that disturbing the past would only make things worse. Mr. Thompson, haunted by the voice of his son Michael and the revelations from the mine, found himself in the middle of this dilemma. He knew the town was on the brink of collapse, but he also knew something had to be done. Determined to find answers, he gathered a small group of residents, those who, like him, had lost someone to the unexplained disappearances. Among them were Margaret, still shaken by her sister's words, and others who had heard their loved ones' voices in the thunder. The group decided that the only way to uncover the truth was to return to the mine, face the ghosts of the past, and, if possible, undo what Samuel Granger and his followers had started. With trembling courage and lanterns in hand, they set out under the stormy sky, the gusts of wind and rain almost pushing them back to their homes. But the determination to find answers was stronger. Upon reaching the mine's entrance, the group was met by the same cold, dense air that Mr. Thompson had felt on his first visit. The trees around them swayed violently, and the sound of the thunder seemed louder, as if the storm itself knew they were about to discover something important. With their lanterns lit, they ventured into the darkness, following the path that led to the chamber where the altar was located. Each step inside the mine was accompanied by whispers that seemed to come from the depths of the earth. The voices, once only in the thunder, now echoed through the tunnels, filling the air with lamentations and words that no one wanted to fully understand. As they neared the main chamber, the lanterns began to flicker, casting shadows that seemed to come to life. Finally, they reached the chamber. The stone altar, now illuminated by the flickering lanterns, looked more sinister than ever. The inscriptions on the walls, which Mr. Thompson had barely noticed before, were now more visible, and a sense of dread gripped everyone. The drawing of the thunderstorm, with the figures pleading for mercy, seemed to almost move under the flickering light, as if the depicted souls were trapped, waiting to be freed. It was Margaret who noticed it first. The inscriptions on the altar weren't just symbols, but a sort of invocation, a dark prayer that Granger and his followers must have used to try and control the forces of nature. As she read the words aloud, her voice trembled, but the group realized they told a story. The story of a pact made with unknown entities, in exchange for power over the storm and control over the spirits it carried. The reading was interrupted by a deafening crash that shook the entire mine. The lanterns flickered out for a brief moment, plunging the chamber into total darkness. When the light returned, the group saw something that left them petrified. Translucent figures began to appear around the altar, shadows from the past taking shape before their eyes. They were the disappeared of Red Hollow, trapped between this world and the next, their faces distorted by suffering. Among the figures, Mr. Thompson recognized his son Michael. The pain in his eyes was palpable, but he couldn't touch him, couldn't save him. The figures, though they seemed to want to communicate, were trapped in a cycle of pain, unable to move on. Margaret, fighting against the fear, tried to speak to her sister, but the words were useless. The souls were imprisoned by the ritual that Samuel Granger had started, and the only way to free them seemed to be to undo what had been done. But how? What could break such an old and powerful pact? It was then that a different voice echoed through the chamber. It wasn't a familiar voice, but one that seemed to come directly from the thunder, an entity presenting itself as the force behind the storm. It demanded a sacrifice, something that Samuel Granger had failed to provide. Only with this sacrifice could the souls be freed and the storm appeased. The group fell silent, the weight of the decision crushing them. If they made the sacrifice, perhaps they could save Red Hollow and free the tormented spirits. But at what cost? And who or what was to be sacrificed? The answers were unclear, but time was running out. The storm outside continued to grow, and the decision they made in that dark chamber could determine the fate of everyone. Mr. Thompson knew that one way or another, the end was near. And as he looked at the figure of his son, a terrible idea began to form in his mind. Perhaps the sacrifice the entity demanded was something he would have to do, something he would have to face alone. But he wasn't ready for that, and the fear of what was to come was almost unbearable. The chamber in the old mine was steeped in suffocating tension. The spectral figures surrounding the group seemed to beg for release, but their words were inaudible, lost in the abyss between worlds. Mr. Thompson felt the weight of the choice he would have to make as the voices in the thunder echoed their demands. With every passing moment, the oppressive presence of the storm grew stronger, as if the very sky was about to collapse on Red Hollow. Margaret, still shaken by the sight of her sister, began to examine the altar more closely. Amid the dark inscriptions and enigmatic symbols, something caught her attention. A hidden passage behind the altar, previously disguised by debris and years of neglect. Without hesitation, she pointed to the passage, and the group decided to follow it, hoping it might lead to some definitive answers. The path was narrow and winding, as if it had been hastily carved in secret long ago. The air grew heavier as they advanced, and the darkness seemed to close in around them. However, Mr. Thompson felt they were approaching the truth, a truth that had been carefully buried but was now being forcibly unearthed by the storm. At the end of the tunnel, they emerged into another chamber, smaller but even more sinister than the previous one. In the center, there was a deep well, its edges covered with symbols similar to those on the altar. The well emanated a coldness that made their skin prickle, and as they drew closer, the group realized that the murmurs coming from it were not mere echoes, but a continuous lament. It was as if something was trapped in the depths, crying out for freedom. It was there that Mr. Thompson made a chilling discovery. Hanging on the chamber wall, on an old faded piece of parchment, was the record of the pact made by Samuel Granger and his followers. The document, written in twisted, difficult-to-decipher handwriting, detailed the ritual conducted in the mine, a ritual intended to summon forces that would grant wealth and power to those who participated. In return, the summoners were to offer a sacrifice of pure blood, something that, according to the parchment, had never been delivered. The pieces began to fall into place in Mr. Thompson's mind. Granger and his followers had failed to fulfill the pact, and as a result, the forces they had summoned turned against them. The disappearances that began after the ritual were the consequence of this failure. The souls of those who were taken were imprisoned, crying out for release, while the storm served as a constant reminder of the broken pact. Worse still, Thompson realized that the entire town was cursed by the unfulfilled pact. Each subsequent generation of residents paid the price for Granger's mistakes, and now the storm was at the peak of its fury, demanding that the debt be finally settled. As the group tried to process this terrifying revelation, the voice that echoed in the thunder became clearer, more insistent. The entity demanded that the pact be completed, that the sacrifice Granger had failed to offer be finally made. The town was at a critical point. Either they complied, or all would be lost. Mr. Thompson, tormented by guilt and pain, looked at the well, understanding that the only way to calm the storm would be through the sacrifice the entity demanded. But who or what would be offered? He knew the choice was impossible, but he also knew that the consequences of inaction would be devastating. As they pondered what to do, Margaret had a sudden inspiration. She suggested that perhaps the sacrifice need not be a human life. If Granger and his followers had failed to offer pure blood, maybe the sacrifice could be something symbolic, something that represented repentance and the desire to atone for past mistakes. An idea began to form, a new ritual that could break the cycle of destruction without the need for more deaths. The hope that sprang from this idea was quickly overshadowed by the reality of what lay before them. Time was running out, and the storm roared with unmatched ferocity, as if the very earth was crying out in pain. Mr. Thompson knew the success of the new ritual was uncertain, but he also knew they had no other choice. They would have to try, or everyone in Red Hollow would be doomed. With the parchment in hand and the town's fate on their shoulders, the group prepared to face the entity one last time. The storm, now almost alive in its fury, seemed to watch their every move, waiting to see if the residents of Red Hollow could finally pay the debt that had been made so many years ago. The tension in Red Hollow was palpable as the group returned to the main chamber of the mine. The storm outside was at the height of its fury, with deafening thunder and lightning that sliced through the sky, briefly illuminating the haunted town. The voices in the thunder echoed constantly, now mixed in a chorus of despair and rage, as if the trapped souls were crying out for both justice and release at the same time. Mr. Thompson, with Samuel Granger's parchment in hand, knew this would be the decisive moment. He and the other members of the group were exhausted, both physically and emotionally, but there was no more time for hesitation. If they failed to appease the entity that had been awakened, the town would be doomed. They needed to complete the ritual that Granger and his followers had left incomplete. But with one difference: the sacrifice would not be of innocent blood, but of something even deeper. Margaret, who had been a source of strength and inspiration for the group, suggested that the sacrifice should be symbolic, a gesture of repentance and remorse for all the sins and secrets the town had buried. The idea was to offer something that represented the desire to atone for the past, something that could finally free the imprisoned souls and calm the storm's wrath. The group began to prepare the altar, clearing away the dust and debris that had accumulated over the years. They placed personal objects on the altar, items that had meaning for each of them, and symbolized the sacrifices they were willing to make. A photograph of Michael, Mr. Thompson's son, Margaret's wedding ring, a memento of her sister, and other similar items, each laden with memories and deep significance. With the altar ready, Mr. Thompson began to recite the words from the parchment, adapting the old ritual with Margaret's help. The words came out of his mouth with difficulty, heavy with fear and responsibility. As the ritual progressed, the chamber seemed to respond, vibrating softly with a strange ancient energy. The spectral figures around the group watched in silence, their gazes filled with a mix of hope and agony. As Thompson spoke, the thunder seemed to lessen in intensity, as if the storm was listening, assessing whether what was being offered would be enough. The air in the chamber grew dense, almost oppressive, and everyone could feel a presence growing around them. The entity that had been awakened by Granger's pact was manifesting, drawn by the ritual. The climax of the ritual came when Thompson, with a trembling voice, made the final offering. May this symbolic sacrifice, these memories of love, loss, and regret, be accepted as payment for the debt that should never have been incurred. May the trapped souls be freed, and may this curse be finally broken. May Red Hollow be forgiven. For a moment, everything was silent. The thunder stopped, and the only sound was the group's heavy breathing. Then, suddenly, one last deafening crash tore through the air, followed by an absolute silence that seemed to swallow everything around. The spectral figures around the altar began to dissipate, like mist under the sunlight, their faces now serene, free from the pain they had carried for so long. Mr. Thompson saw his son Michael among them, smiling for the first time in years. A wave of relief and sadness washed over him simultaneously. Michael waved at him, a silent farewell before disappearing completely. But as the figures vanished, the chamber began to shake violently. The walls seemed to be collapsing, as if the very mine was caving in on them. The storm outside began to roar again, but this time there was something different in its sound. A wild fury, as if the entity was not satisfied with the sacrifice offered. It was Margaret who realized it first. The ritual had freed the souls, but the entity, the being that had been summoned by Granger, still demanded the sacrifice it had been promised so many years ago. And now, it was angrier than ever. "We need to get out of here," Thompson shouted as stones began to fall from the ceiling. The group ran desperately through the mine's tunnels, the lantern's light flickering as the darkness seemed to chase them. The sound of the storm, growing louder and louder, seemed to resonate inside the mine, threatening to engulf everything in its path. Finally, they managed to escape the mine, only to be greeted by a terrifying sight. The sky over Red Hollow was ablaze, as if the very air was on fire. Red lightning streaked across the sky and the ground trembled beneath their feet. The storm had reached its climax, and now, without the souls to imprison, the entity seemed determined to destroy everything. Mr. Thompson, Margaret, and the others knew they had done all they could, but they also knew that the final sacrifice was still to come. And in that moment, they understood the darkest truth of all. The sacrifice the entity demanded was more than symbolic. It was a blood price that still needed to be paid to save Red Hollow from total destruction. The decision they feared was finally before them. What would they be willing to sacrifice to save the town? And who would be willing to pay the final price to appease the wrath of an entity that had waited so long? The answer lay in Mr. Thompson's hands as he looked up at the burning sky, knowing that the fate of Red Hollow now depended on one last and terrible act of courage. Red Hollow was ablaze. The sky lit up with red lightning as the ground trembled under the feet of the residents who, in desperation, ran for shelter. The group that had escaped the mine, led by Mr. Thompson, watched the devastation around them with a mixture of terror and resignation. They had freed the imprisoned souls, but now they faced the wrath of an ancient and relentless entity that demanded the sacrifice it had been denied for decades. Mr. Thompson, physically and emotionally exhausted, knew the time had come to make a final decision. The voices in the thunder, once mixed and indistinct, now resounded with terrifying clarity, demanding what Samuel Granger and his followers had failed to offer. And the price that needed to be paid was a sacrifice of pure blood, something that could not be symbolized by objects or memories. As the group desperately tried to think of a solution, Margaret, with tears in her eyes, approached Mr. Thompson. "John," she said, using his first name for the first time since they had known each other. "There's no other way. The entity needs something that truly matters, something that carries the weight of regret and love. I feel like I know what needs to be done." Thompson looked at Margaret, seeing the determination in her eyes. He had already lost so much, and the thought of losing more was unbearable. But at the same time, he knew that the destruction of Red Hollow could only be avoided with an act of true sacrifice, something that would show the entity that the mistakes of the past would not be repeated. As the storm roared more fiercely, Thompson finally understood what Margaret was implying. She was willing to sacrifice herself to offer her own life to appease the entity. She had lost everything she loved, her sister, her peace, and now she was ready to take the final step. "No," Thompson said firmly, holding Margaret's hands. "You can't do this. I can't let you sacrifice yourself for a mistake that wasn't yours." Margaret, however, shook her head, determined. "We have no other choice. Someone has to pay the price, and I have nothing left to lose. If this can save the town, save the people who are left, then it's worth it." Thompson felt a deep pain in his chest. He didn't want to accept the idea, but he knew Margaret was right. The entity demanded a sacrifice, and only an act of true love and repentance could calm its fury. He thought of Michael, his son, and the lives that could still be saved. It was a terrible choice, but also the only one left. "I'll go with you," Thompson finally said, his voice firm but full of sadness. "We'll do this together." Margaret smiled sadly, and together they walked to the makeshift altar in the town center where the group had performed the previous ritual. The other residents, realizing what was about to happen, began to gather around, forming a silent and solemn circle. The storm continued to rage above them, but there was a tension in the air, as if the entity itself was waiting to see what would happen. Thompson and Margaret knelt before the altar, and he held her hand tightly, trying to convey some comfort in that desperate moment. Margaret closed her eyes, murmuring a silent prayer, while Thompson took a ceremonial blade that had been left there by Granger's followers so long ago. The silence around them was oppressive, broken only by the distant sound of thunder. "May this sacrifice be accepted," Thompson said, his voice hoarse, "and may Red Hollow be forgiven for the sins of the past." With a quick, decisive motion, he used the blade to make a small cut on Margaret's palm, letting the blood drip onto the altar. Margaret did not flinch, keeping her eyes closed, accepting her fate with a serenity that can only come from someone who had made peace with their past. As the blood touched the altar, something extraordinary happened. The storm, which had threatened to destroy everything around it, began to calm. The thunder decreased in intensity, and the red lightning that had torn through the sky vanished, replaced by a soft light emanating from the altar. It was as if the sky itself was accepting the sacrifice, as if the entity was satisfied. The spectral figures that had disappeared in the mine began to reappear around the altar, but this time their expressions were of peace and gratitude. Michael, Thompson's son, was among them, and upon seeing him, Thompson felt an overwhelming wave of emotion. He knew he was about to lose Margaret, but at the same time, he knew that her sacrifice had been enough to save the town. But then, something unexpected happened. The entity, instead of taking Margaret's life, began to absorb the energy of the sacrifice in a different way. The light around the altar shone intensely, and a voice, soft and ancient, echoed in everyone's minds. "The sacrifice has been accepted. The cycle is complete." Margaret, who had prepared for the end, opened her eyes and realized she was still alive. The storm, now reduced to a light rain, seemed to be dissipating completely. The ground under their feet stopped trembling, and the spectral figures began to disappear, but not violently. Rather, they seemed to dissolve into light, finally free to move on. Thompson, in disbelief, looked at Margaret, who was equally perplexed. I'm still here," she murmured, her voice trembling. "The entity accepted the sacrifice," Thompson said, feeling tears streaming down his face. "But it didn't take your life. It took what you offered, your love, your courage, your will to save others." As the light around the altar faded and the rain continued to fall gently on Red Hollow, Thompson and Margaret knew the worst was over. The town had been saved, not by blood, but by a true sacrifice of love and redemption. The cycle was finally broken, and the terror that had haunted Red Hollow for decades had come to an end. But as Thompson looked up at the sky, now clear and starry, he knew the town would never be the same. The past had left deep scars, and the sacrifice made that night would be remembered forever, a lesson about the dangers of meddling with forces beyond human understanding and the redemption that only true repentance could bring. The gentle rain falling on Red Hollow was a welcome relief after the storm's devastating fury. The town, which had seemed on the brink of destruction, was now enveloped in an almost surreal calm. The residents, still dazed by the events of the past hours, began to emerge from their homes, cautious but relieved to see that the worst had passed. Mr. Thompson and Margaret remained by the altar for a while, absorbing the magnitude of what had happened. The symbolic sacrifice, made with sincere love and repentance, had broken the cycle of terror that had haunted Red Hollow for decades. The entity, satisfied with the offering, had chosen not to take more lives, allowing the town to continue, though not without consequences. As the first rays of the sun began to peek over the horizon, the two finally stood up, exhausted but grateful to have survived. Margaret, though relieved to be alive, felt strangely empty. The sacrifice she had been willing to make had been accepted, but not in the way she expected. Still, the town was saved, and that was what mattered most. "You did what needed to be done, Margaret," Thompson said, placing his hand gently on her shoulder. "Your sacrifice was greater than any of us could have imagined." Margaret simply nodded, still processing everything that had happened. The sky, now clear and serene, seemed a cruel contrast to the inner storm she felt. She had prepared to give everything, and though she had survived, something inside her had changed forever. The return to town was silent. The residents who had gathered around the altar looked at Thompson and Margaret with respect and gratitude, recognizing that the two had played a crucial role in saving Red Hollow. However, there was also a silent understanding that the town would never be the same. The secrets of the past had been revealed, and the scars of the storm would remain. In the days that followed, life in Red Hollow began to return to normal, or at least to what passed for normal after everything that had happened. The houses were repaired, the streets cleaned, and people began to try to move on. However, there was a noticeable change in the air, a collective understanding that Red Hollow had been deeply marked by the recent events. Mr. Thompson, who had always been a reserved man, became even more introspective. He spent much of his time in the church, seeking comfort in the memories of his son Michael, and trying to find peace after the sacrifice made. The nights were especially difficult because, although the storm had passed, he still heard distant echoes in the darkness, reminding him that the dead were never truly absent. Margaret, for her part, found new strength within herself. The sacrifice she had been willing to make gave her a renewed sense of purpose. She began to help other residents deal with their losses and traumas, offering support and understanding. The experience transformed her into a central figure in the community, someone others turned to in times of trouble. But there was a silent understanding between Thompson and Margaret that the peace in Red Hollow was fragile. The entity had been appeased, but the events that had awakened it could not be easily forgotten. Both knew it was vital for the town to remain vigilant, learning from the mistakes of the past and ensuring they were never repeated. One night, weeks after the storm, Thompson and Margaret met again in the church. The place was quiet, lit only by the candles on the altar. They sat side by side in silence for a while, each lost in their thoughts. "Do you think we're really safe now?" Margaret finally asked, breaking the silence. Thompson reflected for a moment before answering. "The entity is at peace for now, but we can't forget what happened. We need to honor the memories of those we lost and ensure that Red Hollow never again toys with forces we don't understand." Margaret nodded, knowing he was right. "We'll make sure of that," she said firmly. "We'll protect our town and teach future generations the importance of respect and humility in the face of the unknown." As they left the church and walked through the now peaceful Red Hollow, Thompson felt a small spark of hope in his heart. The town had survived a terrible test, and although the scars remained, there was also a renewed strength among its residents. They had faced the ghosts of the past and survived, and now they were ready to build a stronger future. However, both knew that Red Hollow would never be the same. The story of the storm, the thunder, and the sacrifices would be told and retold for generations, as a warning and a reminder of what happened when the secrets of the past were revealed. And although the town was at peace, Mr. Thompson and Margaret would continue to keep watch, knowing that sometimes the silence that follows the storm is just the beginning of a new journey.